Tonight's guest is my friend, mentor, and an amazing ADHD coach, Jeff Copper. You might recognize him as the host of Attention Talk Radio. Tonight we're going to talk about his dyslexia and ADHD and how these have impacted his life. We're also going to talk about some of the workarounds that he's figured out to manage the challenges that come with dyslexia. Enjoy the show. Here is the great thing about interviewing Jeff Copper. I don't need a script. I know Jeff Copper, so I don't have to read his bio. I can tell you that Jeff Copper is a phenomenal ADHD coach. He has a coaching practice, Dig Coaching. You can find him at digcoaching.com. And more importantly, at least in my world, Jeff Copper is the host of Attention Talk Radio. That's right. And Jeff has been on the air with Attention Talk Radio for, is it 6 or 7 years now?
I think it's 8.
8 years now. And that's one show every week for all 8 years. It's quite a library of interviews that he has. And I know we're talking about you, Jeff, but I had the good fortune, in case my audience didn't know, of being your co-host for a year.
That was a spectacular experience, and yes, you worked for your...
It was, and I also am blessed to be able to be on your show every once in a while, but today I asked you to come on my show, Your ADHD Life, not because we're going to talk necessarily about ADHD, but because you talk a lot about the fact that you have dyslexia. Which means that one of my jobs when I was your co-host was reading everybody's bio.
Yeah, I miss those days.
I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do. You do just fine. So, and so I asked you to come on, though, and talk about the experience of having dyslexia. And I'll say that it's interesting because just today, and I think the post was from yesterday, I had a mom who commented on one of my posts on Facebook that her son has ADHD and dyslexia. And that's very common in the learning disabilities world, yes. For kids and adults to have both of those. Tell me about your experience with that.
So, it's interesting because the best way to really understand my experience is literally it's a symbol retrieval problem. I'll look at a B, but I'll say like a D, or I'll look at a word and I'll retrieve a different symbol for it. And it's interesting because over the years when I was a kid, they didn't get what dyslexia was about. And I can remember being tutored all the way through elementary school and junior high. And it was actually very frustrating because I'll never forget this one person sat there and there was a word, because I couldn't spell out anything. I mean, I couldn't sound anything out phonetically, but they would cover it each letter at a time, and I would make the sound, and then they would reveal it and say it, and I couldn't do it. And it was interesting to me how they were getting mad at me. And I'm like, I'm trying as hard as I can. And I have to tell you, that was my experience.
People taking it personally that you weren't learning what they were trying to teach you.
Yeah, I'm not an idiot. If you're the very problem I'm having with, you're breaking it down and you're asking me to do that. I mean, I know I have that problem. You're not helping me. And it just got to be adversarial. It was always, you just sat there and they didn't know what to do. And I didn't know what to do. But there was this pressure and this frustration. And that was my experience with ADHD, like literally all the way up through high school. And I really want to emphasize it is the worst part about it was nobody actually tried to understand my experience and kind of get me. And it would have done a world of good. I mean, Ned Hollowell talks about that first grade teacher that, as he described, she was a large woman and with a lot of powder and stuff. And she brought him over to read and put his arm around him and, puffed like powder's floating all over the place. And she got the smell. And he says, in that moment, I kind of felt safe. And that really kind of describes, nobody ever really kind of tried to get me and kind of work my way through it. So that was really kind of my experience. Now, the thing about dyslexia that's interesting is we're supposedly very big picture, spatially oriented, and can see things. And I'm going to digress here for a second. I met Nancy Rady years ago at the ADHD Coaches Organization conference in a very unique way, which I won't tell a story, but the first time I met her, she forced me to read The Dyslexic Advantage, which I did, which is a spectacular book. And there was some great things in that book. And one of them that would just really rung true for me, the higher you go in education, the better you do. So I was a very, very poor student in high school. I got through in college. And then when I got my MBA, I did very well. And it was interesting because I got my concentration in finance. Rote rules of accounting are difficult for me, but spatial relationships, because it's always this ratio compared to that ratio type of a thing. And it really, really kind of describes my life. So now going back to when I was getting out of high school, the one thing that happened to me that was really, really fortunate is I went to school on a swimming scholarship, which is probably the only way I would have gotten in school because my grades were so bad. In the first semester, I had to take sociology of sport because like anything else, they figured, oh, if he's interested in it, he's going to read it.
Right.
Yes, I like sports, but no, I can't read. And I literally, the reading volume was so massive. I was like, what am I going to do? I mean, I just can't do it. I mean, I was in tears. And so one day I said, I just can't keep up. So I started reading the first sentence of each paragraph of a Soch book, which is a run-on sentence by definition. So then I just got to where I read the first line of each paragraph. And I would just kind of skim through the book. And it was interesting to me because that was the first time that I really tried to do it my way to survive. But that was also the first time, I didn't know it then, but I don't read the literal words. I read the gist of the message that's underlying it. And so if I went to class and I took notes, I could follow the text and get the gist of what was going on and relate it and get an A- in the class. And the reason that this is really, really important is because that was the beginning of me realizing how I think differently. When I watch like the show Friends or anything like that, I don't remember the names or the person. It's the who they are, the gist behind them that I recall.
The story.
The story or that person's position in the story and how they relate to other people. I can't remember their names, but I see them as a relationship and how they're intertwined, not as a rote thing. So you fast forward. Actually, the other thing about that class that was transformational too is I had to write a research paper. And since reading was really difficult for me, the idea of going and to the library and reading was overwhelming, but it was sports and I was an athlete. And I don't remember what the paper was that I did, but it occurred to me, Indiana is where I went and they had lots of subject matter experts. And whatever the paper was, I found the subject matter expert and I interviewed them and ultimately took their quotes and used those as footnotes in my paper. And it was a huge thing to me because wait a second, it's perfectly legal. I mean, it's done all the time, but it was my way of doing it. And I didn't really know at the time, but that was really the point in time, like business-wise and academically and stuff. I just said, the hell with everybody else. I just started to do it my way. And it was a big deal. I was no longer listening to the experts tell me the way to do it. And I was using my own creativity to find unique ways to get around it. And so since that time, it took a really long time to do it and took a real long time to own it. But interesting in that process is I still have a lot of difficulty with people, particularly when I'm learning something, because I need it given to me in a certain way and nobody really gets that. They give it to me in their way. And so I'm a very intense learner, and I'll actually tell you that before, like, you're going to not care for this experience. It's just the way I learned to take the pressure off. And again, still there's some issues with it, but what's interesting is because I see the connections and stuff like that, I begin to do some things together. And you and I, when we used to do the radio shows together, it was really pretty funny because we'd be interviewing somebody and all of a sudden I would go off on a rant. So this interview relates to this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. And you'd go like, where did that come from? I go, I don't know. It's just the way I think because they're all kind of tied together. So back to the original question, what's my experience? It's exceptionally frustrating when I was a kid. Nobody understood it. And I didn't understand them. But to me, it was when I let go and started to do it my way that I really started to find I could be successful. I still have issues today when I'm bumping into things. Even now, business-wise, I've got some other like people that I know that are very intelligent, and they send me things sometimes, and it's just like, I can't get this. Like there's a website called Alignable or something right now. It's a networking type thing. It's simple for everybody else, but I just can't get my head around it. And so that's still frustrating to me. But the bottom line is I think differently. I know that I think differently. Sometimes I'm celebrated for it. Most of the time, people look at me really, really kind of funny. But for me, that creativity and the way I think differently, I found a home in coaching, and that's why I really like what I do, because it's the one place on earth that I can go and usually I'm not looked down on for the way I think. Actually, it's kind of fun to see the curiosity. So it's a long-winded answer. I hope it kind of gave you some insight, but that's been my way I describe my experience.
So one of the first things you were talking about was switching letters. And I just want to, hopefully you can clarify, dyslexia is not just about switching letters, and oftentimes that's what it's boiled down to for the general public. Can you tell me a little bit more about and I'm sure that it was in some of what you just said, but some of the other things that you notice are a challenge for you that have to do with reading, numbers, things like that are attributed to dyslexia?
So again, the world's like, if I'm looking at a B, I'll retrieve a D. That looks like I'm reversing the numbers. It's not a switch, it's a retrieval issue. I'll look at, I mean, I've done this before with you. I can't remember the exact one, but I've looked at you and retrieved a different name that started with a K.
Yeah.
So when I look at numbers, I'll look at it and retrieve it differently. I really have a lot of problems with the word through and throw and thought and those types of things, because it's all kind of jumbled together. I also have some difficulty sometimes with procedural memory instructions. So like algebra would be an area of challenge for me, because it's when I'm retrieving, if you will, the rote instructions on how to do that, it gets kind of jumbled sometimes and I get off. And that can be very, very frustrating for a variety of reasons. For me, if I have a general idea of what I'm trying to solve, I will come up with the step that I need to get there by figuring my way through the problem as opposed to rote procedure. And that's a unique thing. I didn't really notice I was doing that until like a couple of years ago, but that's definitely a challenge in doing that.
One of the things you talked about was getting the gist of things. And do you think that has to do with basically like pulling the words out that are familiar and putting them together to get the idea of it, or is it a different process that you're using?
So let me tell a couple of other stories.
Okay.
Okay, so let me back up. One of the things that dyslexics supposedly really are good at, and I really identify it, is I understand analogies and metaphors.
Yes.
I talk almost exclusively in those.
You do that well.
I'm going to do one right now. So when I look at things, I'm looking at this thing behind it. So I'm coaching a couple one time on their dining room table, believe it or not. It's a mess. And I was asking them a whole bunch of questions. What's on? I won't go into the details, but sarcastically, I said, where are you going to put the sorting table? I said, what? I said, where are you going to put the sorting table? I said, we don't need one. I said, well, no. The closest flat surface when you walk in the house is your dining room table, and that's where you put the mail to be sorted to his office, her office, the soap, the toilet paper. I said, you're naming it a dining room table, but it's functioning as a sorting table.
Yep.
And you need to set up a table so that you can put the stuff on. That way it can be the dining room table. And the funny part about that story was there was like 70 seconds of silence, and then they go, oh, and they renamed it the sorting table and said it was working perfectly. So that metaphor of the name of it is a dining room table, but what's under it functionally is a sorting table. That's how I think. So when I'm listening to or reading something, I'm trying to get the gist of it. It's kind of metaphorically like that. It's not the literal words.
Right.
It's the bigger picture of kind of what's going on. Another example is you'll take a look at social media, and this is for me. I'm like, what is this? What's this about people? It's a social type thing. And a guy told me one time, is like, Twitter is a real good gossip social media. If you gossip a lot, like Paris Hilton or the guys on ESPN,
Trump.
It's great for Trump. It's great for that type of stuff because it's gossip. It's trying to listen, but it's not for some other things. So that's not really. I haven't come up with a real good example of the gist because it's not coming to me. But as you can see, there's this thing under it that I listen to that everybody else doesn't. And by the way, that's the frustration, because if I sit down and say, "Hey, Kirsten, what's this all about?" I'm looking for that. You have no idea what I'm talking about. It's hard for me to articulate. Oh, I got one. Okay, so this is how I think.
You know what I love is as you were talking, I could tell that in the background you were processing, trying to come up with something.
Okay, so this is a great example. So bear with me here.
Okay.
Kirsten is a noun. It is Kirsten. It's a label. When I think of Kirsten, I think of Kirsten. Her is a pronoun. It points to a noun, right?
Right.
So her, which her? Mary or Kirsten? I don't know. Well, okay, Kirsten, now I know exactly what's going on. But think of noun is a data point, and a pronoun is directed to a pronoun directed to it. Now, let's go to the word how. How is a motion picture. But how is it's an adverb that describes a verb. So it describes the picture, right?
Right.
So in my world, it's pretty funny because the word how is fascinating to me. Because when you say how, you're talking about a process or something that's a bunch of pictures, if you will. Now, I've broken it down to there's three kinds of how. There's how you operate something, like sending an email, right?
Right.
On your iPhone, I know how to send an email, but that doesn't mean you know how to set up email like IMAP or POP. That's a set of instructions. That's more methodical. It's like you get the instructions 1, 2, 3, 4. And then there's what I call insightful how, and that is the gist and what's really all kind of behind it. So like for Jeff Copper, I'm a very visual person, and when I use my iPhone and stuff like that, I want POP email on it because when I delete the email, it's gone visually. Problem with it is it doesn't replicate to all my devices. IMAP shows up on all your devices and stuff all the time. But if you fundamentally don't know the difference between POP and IMAP on the server, you can't actually configure everything to get it the way that you want it to. And an iPhone, an iPad, Outlook, all those things are really different. So when you can do everything else. But for me, when I'm coaching people and they go, I know how to do that. Okay, I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. That 3D spatial concept of that now gives me a roadmap that I don't think other people have, that I begin to sit there and I begin to listen to them and ask them questions to really get where they're coming from. And that level of thinking, like I said, I don't know anybody that does, but to me, it's so clear. How is to a verb as a pronoun is to that, but there's three different kinds of how. So what exactly are you talking about? And when it comes to those with ADD, they know the outcome, but very few of them know the procedural process that gets them there. And I don't care about the outcome. I care about the process that you get there. And so that way of looking at it is just the way I think, that I think works for the ADD crowd in what I do. So I don't know.
It makes you a great attention coach because you're always talking about,
and so
how
is it directs your attention.
Yes.
Like, how do I operate? How do you set this thing? How do you get up? It's very much an attention-based discussion. So anyway. Amazing.
I want to tell you something that's really funny. And this is not a criticism of you. It's just, so over the years, we've gone to conferences and I have a few friends who've introduced themselves to you numerous times. They haven't been on your show, but they're always at the conferences, probably more so than I am. And they always say to me, what is up with Jeff? No matter how many times I've introduced myself to him, every time I meet him, it's like he's never met me before. And I'm like, well, isn't that fantastic? But it goes back to how you attend to things. And if, most people think, I've introduced myself enough times, he should know my name at least. Well, I don't know about you. I know faces more than names. I'm horrible with names.
Yeah, so you
and if there's no context besides introducing myself to you, if we haven't created a story for you to have a reference point that's meaningful to you, why would you, right?
Yeah, so you're spot on. I don't visually see a name and label it. It's very much contextual where I kind of place it. And if I'm dealing with you on something like that, I don't have a context to put it in. I do have a real difficulty with recall. I have a lot of strategies that are in place where I'll walk up to somebody and say, listen, that's number one. We have 49 more times where I'm going to ask you your name again. And I play around with that. Or I'm still trying to remember my name, so please don't feel bad if I ask yours again. So I start adjusting expectations as much as I can. For the people that are really close around me, particularly at the ACO conference, I'll go up to them and I'll say, listen, particularly a few of them is, I'm having some difficulty. Years ago it was really difficult because when I was doing my show and it was starting to get known, people were coming up to me left and right. And I was it's like 300 against 1. And I get overwhelmed by some of that stuff and I do the best I can. I have learned some tips from a, what do you call it? A OBGYN who delivers babies. I was with this guy.
That's not where I thought you were going.
we're in a parade, and they're like, "Hi, Dr. So-and-so. Hi, Dr. So-and-so." And after a while, I'm like, "You have no idea who that is." He goes, "Yeah, when you deliver their baby, they know you like this, everybody, but to me, it's just another woman." And so I began to study, and there's some things that I do with that, but you have to kind of pick up on some things like that. And there's some things that you do when you have dyslexia. It's just to kind of avoid humiliation. So like one of my favorite ones is because I have difficulty with reading, particularly when you put me on the spot. Years ago, I was vice president of an organization, and we had our Christmas party, and the president walked up and said, "Hey, listen, you're going to give out these awards to all your people like last second." And I'm like, at the time, my wife, she looked over me. She's like, "You could, like, what are you going to do?" And I'm like, all of a sudden, what came to my mind, I'm not wearing my contacts.
Brilliant.
I don't wear glasses at that time. But it was just this thing that I had to do to avoid the humiliation, which kind of goes back to when Nancy Rady and I met, and she was like telling about this book,
The Dyslexic Advantage.
She and I were hooting and hollering about all that kind of stuff because people don't understand. I'm an intelligent person, but if I get up there and I'm have to spell something out phonetically, it's just not going to happen, and you're not going to get the guidance. It's going to be awkward, and sometimes you just do stuff like that. It's. I got out unscathed that time. And the guy never noticed that I didn't wear glasses. But anyway, it was these are the types of things that you've got to do creatively just to kind of get by.
So learning for you, so if do you do well with audiobooks? Does that make a difference, hearing a story out loud as opposed to having to see it visually on the page?
That's interesting. That's changed over the years.
Yeah.
I think literally what I do now, like number one, I only read textbooks. I only read what I have to read.
Okay.
And so, like, I read the book Spark by John Rady. That's really a textbook to me because it's got a lot of factual information. And now what I do is I go through it, and to learn that information, I actually read it.
Yep.
And I have a highlighter that I highlight it. And then I go back through and I read it with the pencil. So I highlight my highlights. Then when I get done, I go through the book and I actually dictate my highlighted highlights.
Yes.
So it takes like 300 pages and boils it like down to 6. And when I dictate that, I will dictate like, okay, every once in a while I'll do a page number. So if I've got to go look something up, I can pull up the book and I can find what I'm looking for relatively quickly.
Yes.
Then I read, because I'm just getting data points. I skim the higher level type stuff, and that's what I will remember. So I'm boiling it all down to the concepts and the gist of it. Then I skim it. Then I go. So like if I'm giving a presentation on, like last year, Womenpalooza, I think I was going on exercise and whatever. I know there's a section on that. I remember it's associated. I go back, I flip through my notes, I dig into the book, and I kind of get the details. But I'm very much a top down, like, okay, it's an elephant. So, so now on the tail, so it's very top down. Like, this is a great way. If I'm saving a file on my hard drive,
yep,
you open up my documents and you get a selection of subfolders. And I go, logically, which one would this be? Would it be in my personal folder, my secretary's folder?
You were talking about that you do top down.
Yeah.
And it was funny because I was thinking, so if he's looking up elephants and he's trying to figure out which folder it's in, and he sees one that says trunk, well, yeah, elephants have a trunk.
Yep.
I was just jumping ahead in my head.
Yep. So literally, I go through the decision tree until there's like 3 files. What's that one right there? That's how I remember things. That's how I organize things. That's the biggest issue is if I got something that should be in 2 places at one time. There's a version control problem with that, but that's how I think, and everything I do is based off that fundamental system.
So when you're reading, you were talking about the reading process, how you highlight and then you use your pencil, and then you go in and you record yourself going through the highlights and some of the higher level stuff. Do you listen back to your recording, or is it just the process of saying it out loud that helps you?
No, I don't listen to it again. I dictate it and it's transcribed. As an example, I've actually got, before this, it was kind of funny because this is Dyslexic Advantage in like 6 pages.
Nice.
And it was just really to jog my memory because I did it a long time ago and dug it up. And so it's like my cheat sheet. So I've got I got a bunch of stuff on Dr. Barkley interviews. I got Spark. I've got this. There's a handful of things. And there's certain places that I go that are
They're like Cliff Notes. They're Jeff's Cliff Notes.
Yep.
Oh, boy, you could publish those.
But it's top level. And again, I have ways of breaking it down because I couldn't recall any detail. I mean, it's just not going to happen. I got to go click all the subfolders in order to find what I'm looking for.
Yep. Yep. So, I mean, you're interviewing a lot of people. That's a lot of information. So, you know, in the absence of reading an entire textbook to prepare for, you know, if Russell Barkley came out with a new book, or Ari Tuckman, who, you know, is on your show a lot, how do you prepare for things like that when A, I know it takes you a long time to read things, and then B, your process adds on to that. So how do you find, is it, other than, I mean, maybe it's just, we know that pre-interviewing is not always the best idea.
Well, so this is really interesting because you and I were talking about this the other day, is sometimes lately I'm starting to have some challenges because I'm talking over the guests a little bit. And the reason for that is I've identified there's only a handful of patterns that are out there, and almost anything that I'm talking to fits into one of those patterns, and that's how I can relate everything to it. They use different words. So like I talk about this a lot. I've interviewed Melissa Orlov about couples, and she talks about the flooding feeling when a couples and how you need to distance yourself. And I've interviewed Autumn Zatani from Sesame Street, talking about in season 43 how they were using the Muppets to help the kids understand emotional self-regulation. I've interviewed like ladies from Impact ADD, but how the amygdala is hijacked. I've done some interviews with Dr. David Now. At the end of the day, when you're threatened with your life, or you feel threatened because your brain can't tell the difference, if you're really threatened, if you perceive threat, or if you're anticipating threat, really doesn't matter. Your brain goes into emotional overload. When that happens, blood is diverted away from your prefrontal cortex, and you can't remember what you know you should do. They all say the same thing with different words. The ubiquitous process is, number one, you've got to catch yourself. I'll come back to that. That's the hard part. But when you do, you take deep breaths because you're trying to get more oxygen in what little blood is going to your prefrontal cortex to bring it online for you to override the primitive brain. Now, Dr. Russell Barkley talks about the automatic brain and the executive functioning brain. I just described that. So what Sesame Street did was they would get up there and have kids show angry faces so they could label it. And then ubiquitous coaching thing is begin to feel your body. So when you feel that anxiety or that pit in your stomach, that's the trigger to catch yourself. And then when you do, you belly breathe, you count 1, 2, 3, and then you brainstorm. In the military, first thing you do is don't panic, take a couple deep breaths, and da-da-da. Melissa Orlov, when you feel that flooding feeling, again, that you feel the physical sensation, pause, take a break, and come back to it. To me, it's all the exact same thing. There's nothing different. It's just different words, which is interesting because everybody thinks that they invented the wheel. So when I interview right now, there's a handful of those and they all fit. And so what's fun for me, and what, by the way, Attention Talk Radio got started because I didn't want to write or do a blog. So I started it like I did the interviewing when I was in sociology of sport. What I did was to have something to talk about. What I never dreamed that I would get was the education that I would get. And I got it my way. And like I said, now I'm confident as a coach, and when I'm looking at people, it falls into one of these things, and I already know it's easy for me to pull it out because I already know what they're going to say. It's just different words. So
you've got your patterns. So talking to parents whose kids are dyslexic and or have ADHD, but dyslexic, what's the most important thing that they need to know about their kid?
Your child sees the world differently, and they do not think like you. The hardest thing to do is to let go of how you think it should be. And the one thing that I've learned from coaching those with ADHD is they are the most efficient people on the planet. There is a really good reason they do everything. And a really good reason they don't do anything, which has kind of cracked me up because people say they're not organized. Well, yeah, they'd be dead if they weren't. They are. That just doesn't look like the way it is. They say they're not motivated. Well, everything you've ever done in your life, you did it because you were motivated to do it. Everything you didn't do it because you weren't motivated to do it at the time. So they're motivated. So again, I see the world this way. Everybody else is going to argue with me because they have different whatever. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, they don't think like you. So quit trying to think they're going to think like you. Stop and try to get them put some powder on.
Put some powder on. Get your book.
Don't get me wrong. It's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
But if you do that, you're a hell of a lot closer than just like
experiment. I always say, yeah. I mean, because putting that into words, especially as a kid, how do you think? How do you do this? It's so hard. I mean, it's like, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I remember when I was a kid and we were doing more difficult math, and I could arrive at the solution, but it was, Kirsten, you need to write down your process on the paper. Well, I know my process is in my head. Putting it on paper doesn't work.
Yep.
So,
well, it's funny because they say Einstein was dyslexic, among other people.
Yeah.
And it's funny because there's a spectacular history special on Einstein on the History Channel. You can get it in iTunes. And I watched it, oh my God, probably 40 or 50 times. And the first 20 minutes is really cool because in 1905, he wrote his 4 miracle papers. And one of them was on this, he called it the special theory of relativity, which later became the general theory of relativity. Now, in simple terms, what that paper described is that time is flexible. It's not linear. And that space is actually curved. It's not, it's malleable, which is hard for anybody to get around with. And so he was writing this thing up, and I think it was in 1912, he actually realized at that point in time his math was wrong. And he was figuring that out. Ultimately, he proved it. And somebody else proved it using a solar eclipse in 1919. But he saw the answer. And it took him 14 years to work backwards to prove what he had seen.
Amazing.
So it took him 14 years to show his work in a kind of way. And it's funny because sometimes, literally, when I'm coaching somebody with ADHD, sometimes we'll do it backwards. Let's solve the problem backwards. Let's plan it backwards. Let's do those types of things. And sometimes you just make a connection. And I'll make another comment here about we'll talk about intuition in a second. But you make these clicks and you don't know why.
Yep.
And because you see something, but the issue is it takes you a little while to articulate what you see. Which goes to this is a theory of mine. I'll never be able to prove it. But there's a great video that you can watch called The Awareness Test. Oh no, if you go, you type in awareness test. It's a video. Yep. And it's a minute and 10 seconds, and it's a little video about some people passing some basketballs. And if you watch it, it's pretty cool. There's a gotcha. Now, in all honesty, that video is a knockoff. It's based off of some research psychologists at the University of Illinois, which I've interviewed on this concept. And at the end of the day, the video is great because you have different kinds of attention. You have narrow attention and scanning attention, passive attention, directive attention, blah, blah. But in that video, it's really pretty cool because narrow attention is like texting or writing something. Scanning attention is like driving down the road, and you have cars that are accelerating and decelerating. You got signs and all that kind of stuff. And the thing about those two is you can't use those two kinds of attention at the same time. No. That's why texting and driving is so bad. So I'm teeing all this stuff up because over my years of studying those with ADHD, they talk about they feel intuitive. Well, what is intuition? It's my gut. All right, I'm Jeff Copper. I have dyslexia. That's not good enough for me. So I've watched it over the years and tried to figure out. How
does intuition work, Jeff?
Here's my take on it, and that is those with ADHD, I believe, my hypothesis, you have a heightened sense of scanning attention. Yes. So when you're driving down the road, you're taking all of this stuff in and you're noticing patterns. You're noticing them like hunters used to kind of walk along and they're like, okay, prey, where's it? And they're sensing the prey would have hidden over there. They're not seeing the fact that they saw the grass bent a little bit in that direction. They're scanning it and it's registering. It's kind of like when you walk in, you go, something's different about this person. God, there's something different. Oh, they shaved their mustache. You picked up with your scanning attention that something different, like there's this picture that you scanned in the background and you're comparing them, but it's not till your narrow attention can point to it that you can prove what your intuition is being picked up. And so with that being said, I believe those with ADHD have a heightened scanning attention, and it's maddening because until you can point it out for sure, you can't prove it. And one of the problems with intuition is there's contextual type stuff. So they'll watch a lot of patterns of behavior and they're reading it. And I might read, intuitively I'm picking up on something from Kirsten, but you And I might be right, but somebody else I might be picking up a similar pattern, but they might be from a different culture. And so the pattern I'm picking up on, I'm scanning it and I'm getting the behavioral type thing, but there's something I don't necessarily know. So I'm feeling that hit, but I'm not right now. So that muddies this thing down. It's trust your intuition, blah, blah. And so my fundamental belief is that, and by the way, scanning and attention would be really good things for many things that we talk about, emergency situations and that type of stuff. But we'll never be able to prove it because your narrow attention has to identify it. And it's an individual thing because it's how you pay attention to it, which it's hard to describe.
Intuitively, it makes sense though, right?
Yep. But for me now, to me that makes all the sense in the world, and that's my definition of it. And when people do that stuff and they go, I'm intuitive. If I'm coaching somebody with ADHD, I begin to start listening to the areas that they're. So, like for example, one of the reasons for this, a lot of people that I coach have ADHD, and they'll play computer games. And I go, well, what games? Because the games, this is underneath it all. If I watch the games, that's going to point my attention in an area that makes some sense. So my older son used to play like Jelly Carl, these like mindless, stupid games. My younger son, it's all sports games, and he's mimicking the game. But it's interesting to me, there's a lot of ADHD kids that are playing Call of Duty. What's the other one? These shoot 'em up games. But I'll ask them, do you play poker or do you like playing chess? And if they say yes, it's interesting because, by the way, some of those people like the cheats. They like to play those games. They like to figure out the cheats. But a lot of them like those games because if you're going to win those games, it's a study of behavior and the pattern.
Yes.
And so I tell this story one time. I was literally coaching this kid because when I'm listening to what's consistent. The kid's likes jazz. He's in crew. He likes fishing, and there's some YouTube stuff. And I was listening to, there's patterns in jazz, there's patterns in crew, and these other things. And we were talking about reading history. And we actually said, let's try a metronome to read. It helped. It wasn't great, but it was definitely helped because I was thinking pattern. But I didn't get the fishing thing. For the life of me, this doesn't fit. And I'm sitting there going, and one day, flippantly, he said, I always want to be a marine biologist. I said, me, what? I mean, I was like, where did that come from? And I asked him some questions, and it dawned on me, oh, he doesn't like fishing. He likes to study the behavior of a fish. Because if he can catch the fish, then he figured it out. And I mirrored that back to him, and it was like, oh my God.
That's funny.
If you, all of a sudden you begin to see that pattern, and by the way, there's a dopamine blueprint with regard into it. And so again, that's kind of how I think, because I'm listening for that pattern type level, and people look like I got like 8 heads, but that's kind of the way this dyslexia sees the world.
I think that's a great another tip to give parents, which is to look at the patterns of how your child thinks about things, does things, where their interests lie, things like that, because that can give you some clues into how they do things.
Let me talk about that for a second, because this is also counterintuitive.
This is the last thing we're going to talk about. I'm just going to tell you that, so you have a template to work from.
When you are trying to make an observation like that, you think that you've got to pay attention to it. That's not the way to do it. You actually have to relax and let it reveal itself to you. A carnivore doesn't know it's a carnivore. It just, like, if it ever I wonder, I'm always out of breath when I'm eating. I wonder why. Well, I was chasing something. I wonder what that is. If you look for something, you're not going to see what you're missing. You have to back up and use your scanning attention and and you have to let go of the pressure. And it's hard for parents because they want to solve the problem, but it's counterintuitive. And this as a coach, it's playful. You got to play. You got to relax. You got to open your mind, and you got to let it come to you. And it's hard for people to do that. But anyway, there you have it.
You got to step back as opposed to being in the midst of it.
Yep.
Absolutely. That's what makes coaches so great. That's what makes you great. I just want to put a plug in here too for a couple things. First of all, if you're an audience member of mine and you haven't listened to Attention Talk Radio, I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose my audience, but Jeff interviews some amazing people on his show and definitely has some great information for everybody, parents, coaches, teachers, just people who are just interested in cool information about ADHD and related things having to do with attention. The other thing is I had great fortune when I was going through mentor coaching, to have Jeff as my coach. And if you are looking for an ADHD coach, I mean, you hear him talking about the clients that he works with. Jeff truly is brilliant. He really helps his clients to see things, to pay attention differently to how they do things, to how things work. And I also want to give a plug. I said this to you the other day. We've been to a lot of conferences, and at every conference, they honor somebody in the ADHD field. And these organizations are all relatively new, so they're still in the midst of honoring the people who helped to found them a lot of times. But when it comes to the field of ADHD coaching, I honestly think, Jeff, that you are one of the founders. You have been here for 8 years doing Attention Talk Radio, bringing to the public information about this field in a way that's accessible. You've got, the radio show, you've got the video now, you've got your newsletter. You've done it more consistently than anybody else. You've interviewed more people from more backgrounds so that we're paying attention to ADHD in all different ways. And I think it comes to the body of information that a person has contributed in the field of ADHD, you are right at the top. And for me, I want to thank you because you are one of the reasons that I went down that path. And I think that other people need to recognize too how much you've contributed. So I want to thank you for everybody else.
I'm humbled by your comments. I appreciate it. It's
I know you, and you are an amazing man. You are. Absolutely. I know you've gone through some struggles this year, but it doesn't take away from the fact that you're the shit. So I swore, whatever.
From the kindest words I've ever, Kirsten, I'm speechless. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Well, thank you. You've done a lot for me, and I know you've done a lot for other people too. So with that, I want to remind people that they can find you at digcoaching.com. And on Attention Talk Radio every Wednesday night.
Yep.
And you're always there, and if you're not, then somebody else will. So I know you've got some things in the works for the future for that. Things are always changing. You're always at the conferences, and I know that you're also really responsive to people who reach out and ask the right questions. So
I'll be as best I can. I love the questions.
Absolutely. Jeff Copper, thank you very much for being a guest on Your ADHD Life.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Kirsten. I'm so proud of you. You are amazing. I'm delighted. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Bye. All right, I'm ending this.
Wow, you're damn good.
If you've enjoyed the show, please like us on Facebook at facebook.com/Your ADHD Life. This is Dr. Kirsten Milliken. Until next time, have fun and find ways to play.